nonprofit leadership, thinking about turbulent times and what it's like to sort of manage out there. Really pleased to be able to have Mark Browning with us. Mark had been on the queue to offer this workshop last spring in person, and so kind of had to put him off, obviously, with all of this, and then finally decided this was probably the best way to be able to go about it. So I really appreciate that Mark comes also able to bring a bit of a sponsorship from Extraco Bank. So it makes a big difference for us as well to be able to kind of continue this series into the fall. We'll have a whole schedule of workshops this fall. So just know that those will be coming out. I think we'll send some details in the chat box probably at the end, but next week is I think Kenny Taylor and Nicole Collier, a couple folks from the center, will be talking a little bit about some of the COVID research data that we've just had completed up, as well as thinking about some of the challenges. Kenny can give some more details on that as we get going. All right, let me introduce our speaker for today. So Mark Browning is the Senior Vice President and Trust Officer at Extraco Bank here in Bryan-College Station. Over 20 years of experience in what they call trust banking. Previously served as a trust and bank organization in East and South Texas. Mark also brings 10 years experience with the Texas A&M University Foundation. So he used to work here with us, working with individuals and nonprofit entities to help think about their philanthropic goals. Fighting Texas Aggie, class of 1988. So back at you there, Mark. My son is coming up too, believe it or not. He'll be graduating next year. So that's great. Substantive additional training from bankers, the Texas Bankers Association, et cetera, et cetera. So Mark's been at this for quite some time and has got some pretty good experience. And we like, obviously, the fact that he's been working on both sides. Mark's been an active member in the community, serves with the Boy Scouts of America, as well the Rio Grande Council, as well as the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, Voices for Children. So many of you know Mark and all of his good work that he does in the community. And so it's a pleasure to be able to have you here, sir. I appreciate it. And I'm going to go on ahead and turn it over to you and let you talk a little bit about this idea of planned giving.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. Dr. Taylor, thank you. Denise, Nicole, thank you all as well for helping facilitate our program today. Greetings from College Station, Texas. That's not College Station in the background. We've not put in a harbor and a pretty seaside campus, but that background reminds me that there is a world out there once we get over this COVID situation, that there are pretty places in the world and in the country that eventually we'll all be able to relax and get out and about. So as we go through the material today, in keeping with the theme, adapting to turbulent times, certainly a planned giving program, in my experience, has been a way that some nonprofits have adapted to their operations being disrupted, their operations having to look for additional resources and additional funding. So keeping with the adapting to turbulent times, and also thinking out of the box as we start our I'll call it a 30,000-foot view of planned giving. Many of the slides I'll go through this afternoon could be programs in and of themselves. So we'll touch lightly, and then of course the slide deck and the presentation are recorded and are available for later access. I'd kind of like to start out setting the stage, getting everyone to think about planned giving as Campbell's soup. When times are bad, people eat more soup. People eat soup all the time when times are good, but when times are bad, people eat more soup. Planned giving is very much the same way. People will make estate gifts, planned gifts when benefiting the philanthropies that they're passionate about. But when times are bad, like they are now, things are uncertain. Asset positions, asset values are volatile and shaky. People would be more willing to consider a planned gift and then perhaps convert that to some current funding a little bit later on. So as I go through the slide deck, we'll keep with those themes. A couple of quick words about Extraco, who's sponsoring today's session. The bank is a third-generation family-owned bank based here in Central Texas with offices in Georgetown, Temple, Waco, and Bryan and College Station. We're building a new branch, in fact, we were talking about just before the program. The bank is about $1.5 billion in assets and has been in the trust business since about 1951. So, a good regional organization that is relatively new to this area. And in addition to talking about just my bank in general, I want people to be aware of and think about ways they might partner, with a trust department, whether us or in the respective region, state where you're at. Because as we go through these concepts, you'll find that it's I think very valuable to partner with a trust department because they will fulfill a lot of the roles in planned giving. Being an executor for a donor's estate, for example, being a trustee of the various types of charitable trusts that we'll talk about, and also serving as an investment management agent and record keeper for your endowment, if you have an endowment. Should you not have an endowment, that's a whole separate conversation, something that we could have offline. I've been involved on the boards of nonprofits and a church that started an endowment from scratch. And so I've been through the pains of doing that and happy to share my experience, again, offline if there's some interest there. Well, let's talk about, when we talk about planned giving, and I'm going to use the term planned giving, estate giving. In the religious context, it could be called legacy stewardship, but these all refer to the same concept. And when we talk about planned giving and talk about a person's estate, in essence, there are three places that an estate can go when you boil it down to its most simple concept. An estate can go to family and friends. It can go to charities, nonprofits, such as the organizations y'all represent. And finally, not so common these days, but some of the estate can go to taxes if you have a donor with a larger estate. Recent tax legislation bumped the exemptions up to about $11.5 million per person and about $23 million for a couple. So you've got a very small segment of the population, but nonetheless, the IRS does factor into some of those larger estates. Now, planned giving is not new. This should not be a new concept to a lot of you. You may have heard a little bit about it, but a great historical reference I like to mention is the Smithsonian. Many of us have either been there or I think probably all of us know about the Smithsonian, but the Smithsonian came about as the result of a contingent planned gift. And as you can see from the slide, British subject James Smithson, when he died, he left his estate in trust for a nephew, and then on to that nephew's descendants after the nephew died. Well, the trouble was the nephew died without any descendants, and so the contingent clause in the trust set up a gift to the United States of America, our young country at the time, and you can see the quote, "To the United States of America to found an establishment for the diffusion of knowledge among men." And so with that very broad, very vague concept, 10 years later came the Smithsonian after the president and Congress worked out all the details. A rather large gift. It was 1.5% of the U.S. budget at the time. So now you know the rest of the story. The Smithsonian came about as a result of a planned gift. And it's just an example of how planned gifts can be very transformational, as it was with the Smithsonian and can be for your organization. So again, let's set the stage. Why is it advantageous to have a planned giving program? Why go through the trouble of this webinar and of the effort that it would require? Well, several very valid points here. Planned gifts, my experience is that they're multiples of a donor's lifetime current giving. My experience when I was with the A&M Foundation was anywhere from 10 to 100 times what a donor would give over their lifetimes. So again, transformational, very large amounts that you're looking at here. It's a great way for existing donors to give additional support, albeit after a lifetime. But a lot of the planned giving methods we'll talk about are revocable, they're flexible. There are a few that are irrevocable, and we'll go into some detail in the coming slides. But very important, I think, for right now, when donors may be pulling back a bit on their current donations, this is a way to engage donors who are passionate about your cause, yet due to the current circumstances, they're not willing to perhaps make a current donation or a large current donation, but you're identifying that prospective pool of passionate donors And later on, you could come back and visit with them about some current opportunities. Another advantage, you're giving from estate assets with planned giving as opposed to income. So you're giving from accumulated assets, whether 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, depending on the age of your donor, you're giving from a much larger pool. And so it behooves a nonprofit to look at this program just again to the size of the potential gifts. And the program can really be as passive or hands-on as an organization has, personnel, resources to commit to the program. Passive would be, for example, putting some information about planned giving on your website and maybe mentioning at some of your events. The active hands-on would be actually bringing this up when making calls on prospective donors, not only for current needs to keep the doors open and keep the lights on and people paid, but have this conversation about how you can support your nonprofit with after lifetime gifts. And a large enough pipeline means regular support. In other words, when you document and bring in a planned gift, we don't know our mortality. It could be 1 year, 5 years, 10, 20 years. But if you bring in enough of these planned gifts, at some point they will start to become regular support. I know my experience with the Texas A&M Foundation, and again, you're talking about an organization that has been doing this for decades. They would book millions of dollars of planned gifts, and each year, because of the work of a lot of prior employees, they would bring in anywhere from $15 to $20 million per year. And again, it's just cumulative effort of having that pipeline in place. So those are some of the advantages. Of course, disadvantages, you have to have current support. Planned giving does not, bring money in to pay salaries and overhead and upkeep, except for the qualified charitable distribution. We're going to talk about that briefly later on. It does take some time. So right now, maybe while current donations are down and you're trying to, look at ways to allocate time resources, this may be something to look at, but it does take some time to commit to donors, to steward them, to document gifts and work with donors on their information needs for planned gifts. And then finally, you want to be careful. Some organizations have, they can get in over their head if they take in a complex asset. Cash, stocks, bonds, residential real estate are pretty plain vanilla. You can get into some very esoteric assets like business interests, commercial property, maybe some environmental risk. Certain oil and gas interests, are not really good for a nonprofit to be involved in. So bear in mind the advantages and disadvantages as you evaluate whether to start a program. Now keep in mind that most Americans think of current gifts. They aren't necessarily thinking of estate gifts, of future gifts. And therein comes the title of the presentation, Thinking Out of the Box. We want to get our donors to think outside of the box, think outside of the writing the check, donating securities, maybe donating some used items. I think of Habitat for Humanity. People donate nice used furniture all the time. They sell that, plow the money back into their operation. We want to start thinking outside of the box. So thinking about bequests, beneficiary designation gifts, and then some life opportunities that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Let's get in. These are some of the gift types. And again, I could drill down a lot more. We're going to keep it at the 30,000 foot view, but here are some irrevocable gift types. And I call these dual benefit gifts because they benefit not only the donor, but they also benefit the nonprofit. And so there's a split interest, if you were, in these types of gifts. Charitable remainder trusts, that's the first one, probably the most common type of irrevocable gift in my experience. And I'll show an example later on, but this is an arrangement where a donor donates cash, appreciated securities, appreciated property to a trust entity that's created by their attorney. The trust will sell the property, reinvest it in a diversified investment pool, and they will pay an income back to the donor or the donor and spouse for their lifetimes or for the term of years. And then upon the last of the income beneficiaries, the nonprofit will get the assets in the trust, or the donor may choose to split up, 25% to this nonprofit, 30% to this nonprofit. It allows them to sprinkle around the funds to the nonprofits that they're passionate about. And I'll show an example here in just a minute. A charitable lead trust is the exact opposite. This is where the charity gets the income stream on the front end, and then the property reverts back to the family after a term of years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever is most appropriate for that donor. So those two types of trusts, again, the family gets some benefit, the nonprofit gets some benefit, and there's some tax benefits in there as well. And then last is a retained life estate. This is an arrangement where, for example, a donor will give maybe a secondary property, a beach home, a lake home. They'll give that to the nonprofit, but they will retain the right to use it for their lifetime. And so the donor still has to pay taxes, has to maintain the property, insure the property, but upon their passing away, the title automatically vests with the nonprofit, who can then sell it and then redeploy the funds as they've agreed with the donor. And we'll look at some examples here. Let's take this charitable remainder unit trust example. I took a 55 and 53-year-old individual, and they're going to benefit their church with this charitable remainder unit trust. So in this case, they contributed property worth $250,000. It had a cost of $125,000, and so there was a gain of $125,000. By putting it in this charitable trust, they will not pay capital gains. The trust, because it is charitable in nature and it's qualified charitable trust, it will not pay any income capital gains tax. So the tax deduction in this case was almost $53,000 that the donors get to utilize. So what happens is the full $250,000 is invested. It pays out 5% of the year-end value. So in this example, the first year would be $12,500. And over the life of the trust, it would expect to be paid out a little over $770,000 to the beneficiaries. And then finally, after the last pass away of the beneficiaries, in this case, a church would get the remaining value of that principal, less all those payments. So, you know, a very, I guess, again, benefits both the donor and the charitable remainder. The minimum is 5% on this kind of an arrangement. The larger the payout you elect, the smaller income tax deduction they get, and vice versa. And also, the younger the donor, the smaller the deduction. So you can do a little bit of working around with the numbers to come up with a desired income stream or a desired income tax deduction, depending on the donor's needs. So that's an example of a charitable remainder unit trust. This is an example of the life estate that I mentioned. So in this case, donating a $250,000 piece of property, you're deeding it over and retaining the right to use it for your lifetime. So in this case, the couple, they get to use it for the remainder of their lives. They get a tax deduction of a little over $52,000 for making this, because they are retaining a benefit. And then after their lifetimes, that property will continue to grow. In this example, under these parameters, it grows to a little over $850,000 that the nonprofit would then sell and then use for whatever purpose they agreed to with the donor. So right now, low interest rates make these life estates very appealing because it generates a higher income tax deduction. But again, maybe a fresh idea for your organization to look at. Now let's look at some revocable after lifetime gifts. Revocable meaning they could be changed. They're not set in stone. They're not permanent like the prior examples. And so we're going to look at several different options: a bequest, giving retirement assets, giving life insurance, and then other beneficiary designation gifts. One point I'll make at the beginning, donors really like these because they are flexible and they are revocable. People's situations change. I'm in my 50s, and by the time, 10 years from now, my circumstances may have changed. So this type of a gift idea allows me to perhaps change my will, revamp my estate plan. So the flexibility is really appealing to donors. So the first one we'll talk about is the bequest. And I would say that if your organization does nothing in the way of planned giving, at least have a basic bequest program in your menu of giving options. My experience with the A&M Foundation was that about 80% of the planned gifts that we received were bequests. They're relatively simple, straightforward. Many of us have been a beneficiary of an estate. Maybe we've received an inheritance, or we've been an executor or executrix to handle an estate. So they're very well known. They're simple. You make a gift in your will, or if you have a will, you can do what's called a codicil, which is an amendment to your will, and you can make provision for charity, for nonprofits in there. So again, if you do nothing else, look into this type of a program because it is so well known and very popular, at least from my experience. Now, there's 3 different ways that you can leave a bequest to a nonprofit. It could be a specific dollar amount, it could be a percentage of the estate, or it could be the rest and residue, meaning I'm giving this gift here, 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 and here, and whatever's left goes to whatever the nonprofit is. Now, I'll pause here when I'm talking about specific amounts. This is a very easy way to start a conversation with your donor. Let's take an example of someone who gives your organization $1,000 a year in current support. A very easy conversation to have is to go to them and say, how would you like to perpetuate that gift? In other words, after you're gone, how do you keep that $1,000 coming to us to do the good work that we do? So in this example, if you want to generate $1,000 a year in perpetual support, the donor would make a $25,000 bequest in their will, and I'm assuming a 4% payout from an endowment, which is a reasonable amount. That's $1,000. Of course, you're investing it to earn a longer term rate, perhaps 7 or 8%, and there's some expenses in there. So you want it to grow at or better than 4% so that payout would grow. But again, a very easy conversation to have with the donor about how to perpetuate their annual giving for years to come. I put up there about having suggested bequest language available, and this is something, it's a document I can provide offline if you're interested, but it's just some verbiage to give to their attorney. Most importantly, it's going to have your organization's legal name in there so that the attorney gets the drafting correctly, and some gift use language perhaps in there. But having that document available either on your website or available upon request makes it very easy for the donor to get with their attorney and work with them to get a planned gift in place to benefit your estate. Now, Texas is like other states. We have some descent and distribution provisions in our state law. If you die without a will, property does pass, to various family members, depending on whether or not you have kids and siblings, things like that. There's a formula in there. But the important thing is that charity is not included in there. No matter how big a supporter that donor was of your organization, if they don't have a written bequest in an estate plan, in a will, the nonprofit gets nothing. So in your conversation, you may find out that the donor does not have a will. And so it's very important that they meet with their attorney and their legal advisor, not only to have a will, but also to include the nonprofit in there as well. Switching gears a little bit, let's talk about the other type of revocable gift, and that's a gift of retirement assets, and particularly pre-tax retirement assets. These are things like individual retirement accounts, 401ks, 403bs, the government thrift savings plan, other employer plans. These are retirement plans that many of you are probably familiar with. And what you don't think about is making a nonprofit a primary or a secondary contingent beneficiary of these types of plans. Again, very flexible. You don't do this through your will, you do it through a beneficiary designation form that the retirement plan provider would have. It's flexible. You can change your mind as long as you are alive and have your mental faculties about you. The big advantage, though, is if it's a pre-tax, by pre-tax meaning the money went in there before income taxes, then it's a very smart asset to give to a nonprofit, because your nonprofit, if you're a qualified nonprofit, a 501c3, you can receive those assets and not pay income tax. Whereas if they're left to family, eventually as the assets are taken out, income tax will be paid. So I guess, commentary you would have in a meeting with a donor is, they might consider other after-tax things like bank accounts, security accounts, real estate. Those are great gifts for families, and if they're going to benefit a nonprofit in their estate, give them this tax unfriendly asset that the nonprofit can receive tax-free. Now, IRAs, individual retirement accounts, this was the one exception I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. This is the one exception to what I'm talking about that is a current gift. Y'all are probably familiar with this, but I would be neglectful if I didn't mention this qualified charitable distribution. If you have a donor who's over 70 and a half, they can contribute up to $100,000 a year directly from their IRA to your nonprofit. That counts as part of their required distribution that they have to take when they get older. They don't get a tax deduction, but they get to count that as the required distribution, and they don't have to count that as income. So it's a great benefit for those folks that are in a situation where they have this IRA, maybe they've been successful otherwise and don't need this IRA, but yet they're mandated to start taking money out. So it's a great way to tap into the donors and get support for your organization and current support. And so the reason I bring it up in the context of planned giving is if a donor does favor you with one of these qualified charitable distributions, the next conversation you have is, well, this is great, we appreciate it. Would you like to learn more about making our organization a beneficiary, a primary or secondary beneficiary of your retirement account? So this conversation leads into another that can provide, again, current support and then some valuable future support. Now, the new tax law that went into place a couple of years ago, they changed the required minimum distribution from 70 and a half to 72. And in fact, because of COVID, some of the earlier legislation this year waived having to take distributions out, for this calendar year. So folks may not be quite so motivated here in 2020, but it's definitely a 2021 conversation starter if you have donors that would fit this profile. Let's talk a little bit about life insurance. Life insurance, what's the old adage is that life insurance protects you from dying too young. So people will get these policies to protect their family, pay off debts, pay off a mortgage. But a lot of times, between the time they bought the policy and the time that they're ready to make a charitable gift, circumstances have changed. Maybe they have no debt. The kids are grown up out of college on their own. And so people will favor nonprofits with their life insurance policies. It could be a change of beneficiary, either a primary or secondary beneficiary. You go to the insurance company, they provide a form, you make that designated change. Okay, my wife is primary, make secondary, this nonprofit for 100%. So very easily done. Or a donor can make a permanent change, which is to change the ownership and the beneficiary designation to a nonprofit. The difference being one is revocable, they can change their mind, and that may appeal to some donors. The other is irrevocable. There are some income tax advantages there. If it's an existing policy, they can deduct the cash value that's in that policy. If they're still making premium payments on that insurance policy, those could possibly be income tax deductible as well. So irrevocable has some income tax benefits. Revocable means just a change of beneficiary and nothing else. So who gives life insurance? And I've talked about some of these examples of people who have policies that the original purpose is no longer there. This is also very good for your younger donor base. Young people can get a large amount of life insurance if they're insurable and healthy, and they can leverage maybe a few $100s of premium payments into a 5 or 6 figure dollar gift for your organization. So a great way to engage younger donors with a life insurance gift. So anyway, something that's not often thought about, but you want to keep in your arsenal of ideas, using life insurance irrevocably or irrevocably as a gift. talking about gift agreements. Okay, now you've got a donor who's, let's say they've made a bequest, they favored your organization, they've gone to their attorney, everything's drawn up, the will's been executed, signed. What to do now? Well, what are they going to do with that gift when you receive it? Some donors, it's great when they leave an unrestricted gift. They leave it to the discretion of the board of the nonprofit. That's very good because between the time you make a bequest and the time that it's realized, maybe many years down the road, we don't know what the need would be for a particular nonprofit. So an unrestricted gift is great. But a lot of times donors, they have some kind of purpose in mind. They want it used for current operations. They want it added to the endowment. Maybe half to endowment, half to current operations. Well, this gift agreement is just a simple memo of understanding between the donor and the nonprofit. You'll outline the type of gift, what it's for, and how the gift will be administered. So again, some important details that without this gift agreement, it's going to be at the discretion of the board. Not a bad thing, but at least offer your donor the opportunity to put a memorandum of understanding or a gift agreement in place. That way they can state any kind of restrictions or any kind of passion they have that they want to dedicate those funds to. Now, getting the gift documented is very important. So I think it's worth a few minutes time to talk about this. Back to my earlier example, you have a will that's been executed. The donor's provided you a copy, so you know that you're named in the will. You've done the gift agreement and signed that between the nonprofit and the donor. So you've documented a planned gift. I'll use the term sometimes, booking a planned gift. You've got one in place. So why is that important? Well, number one, you want to be able to say thank you. Especially with a revocable gift, the donor can always change their mind and revoke that gift. If they say they're leaving you half their estate and it's going to be 6 figures worth of assets, and they never hear from you again, well, they could march down the street to another nonprofit that they're passionate about and switch the gift to them. So appreciation, thank you goes a long ways, whether it's a note, annual birthday card, some other ideas, or a legacy society, groups of like donors, where you have some kind of appreciation event, maybe a coffee, a luncheon, a special program, or early access to a program that you're working on. Some type of, again, acknowledgement and appreciation to keep those donors engaged, especially those that can change their mind later on. The donors should have the option of being anonymous. Some donors, they don't want to call attention to themselves. Very important about documenting gifts is the opportunity to correct errors. I know Teresa Mangapore, I'm gonna use an example. You were, I know, registered for the call. A good example, and I'll use the food bank of the Brazos Valley as an example. Let's say a donor left the food bank of the Brazos Valley in their will, and they didn't document. It was a surprise. You got a call from an attorney one day or executor that says, you're getting $100,000. But the name on here says Brazos Valley Food Distribution Network, some made up name. Well, that's a problem because your legal name is not reflected in those documents. Had that gift been documented on the front end, you had opportunity to correct that verbiage to your legal name and therefore prevent any problems after the donor's passed away. Sometimes you can make some corrective action, with court action. Other times, maybe not so much. I had an example of this. A trust that I administered was being left to a heart association up in the Midwest. The donor was from, I think it was Michigan originally. Well, the name that they put in the trust did not match up exactly to a heart association in the state of Michigan. It was very close, but it was not clear. We ended up having to go to court and get a declaratory judgment, that this was the correct organization, that we think the donor intended to benefit. But meanwhile, the funds were delayed getting to that nonprofit. We had to incur legal costs, and so all that could have been cleared up on the front end. You had the donor documented, or the nonprofit worked to get that documented and corrected on the front end. So again, not to beat this to death, but it's very important to get a gift documented, for multiple reasons. stewardship, and legal reasons. I'm going to wrap up the presentation, spending a few minutes here talking about marketing plan gifts. And again, this could be a separate presentation in and of its own, but I'm going to give you just some very quick bullet points of some things I've seen in my experience that would help a nonprofit promote this type of activity. Again, whether passive or a little more active and hands-on. Certainly under your website, you want to give mention the fact that under your donate portal, you know, they can make a donation online, but maybe a separate tab into that donate portal. You know, here's some of these gift ideas, the bequest, the life insurance, etc. So put it under your website. Don't reinvent the wheel. Look at some other organizations, see what they've done. The Vannie E. Cook Cancer Foundation was a nonprofit board I used to sit on, and I helped them get a plan giving program in place. They're out there on the web. Go look and see what they did. Texas A&M Foundation has an excellent website to go look at. So look and see what other people have done, but use your website to not only promote current donations, but talk about plan giving as well. Social media is a great way to put out some little snippets of information, drive some traffic to your website, you know, drive a phone call, you know, to your development officer. There's a Facebook page out there called Out of the Box Philanthropy. They post some little snippets about plan giving regularly, and so, you know, that's a good site to, you know, pick up some ideas on little snippets, little brief mentions of plan giving. Direct mail and email is effective for some organizations. Perhaps highlight a different type of gift plan, you know, bequest one month and leaving retirement assets the next month and so forth. You know, highlight some of the different ideas. And again, drive traffic to your website and to your development staff. A plan giving council, this was something that we used at A&M, but it was a group of legal, tax, financial advisors, and those that are sympathetic to your cause. Maybe past board members, could be a current board member, somebody in the community that's really passionate about your organization and their purpose. They can not only be additional eyes and ears and voices for you out in the community, but depending on the type of relationship you have with your plan giving council, they may be willing to answer a question or two if you run into a quick tax question, quick legal question, that could be a resource to you. So look at a plan giving council as a way to help promote plan giving. Articles, that's kind of redundant. I mean, you know, you put that in direct mail, a website, but having some articles out there about plan gifts, again, gift types, things like that. The most effective, and in my opinion anyway, is a donor story with pictures. So in addition to documenting that planned gift, ask that donor, would they be willing to share their story? Not the details of their gift. In other words, no dollar amounts, no specific details, but the concept. Yes, I made a bequest to your organization because I'm passionate about this aspect of your organization, and I read about your organization in this publication. Something just talking about their story. We as human beings, we communicate very well with stories, and so telling that story and then having a picture of that donor will resonate with future donors. People will read that and say, wow, that's my situation. I understand, you know, where they're coming from. That matches my situation. So get that donor, if they're willing, to let you write a little bit of a story about them, put that on your website, maybe feature that in your article or in some direct mail, but collect those donor stories as you receive and document planned gifts. Again, most effective in my opinion. Certainly your annual fundraising events merit a mention of estate gifts, planned gifts. Response cards. Many of you will set these out, maybe at an annual event, you'll set out a card on the table, or you'll include that with a direct mail piece. You know, I'd like to pledge this one-time gift or $100 a month. Add a couple of check boxes there. One of those check boxes would say, yes, I've already included you in my estate. You know, some donors are very savvy. They've gone out and done the research on what they can do to leave a planned gift to your organization. Get them to check that box. That's a very easy contact to make. You simply follow up with them, ask them if they'll document that gift, ask them if they'll give you an inspirational story to share with other donors. And then that second box you want to put on your response card is, I would like more information about plan giving. And that way, again, an open invite for you to follow up with them and contact them about some of these different methods that I've talked about, and how one of those might be a fit, for that donor to your organization. I've touched base on the Legacy Society, so I won't elaborate there. Your board's role is very important. A number of you, your board of directors, are required to make some kind of a support, maybe a current gift, other tangible support to the organization as a prerequisite of board service. This might give some board members an additional option. They can make a current gift, or perhaps you got a younger board member who brings some really great time and talent, but not a lot of treasure to the table. They could fulfill their financial obligation to your organization with a plan gift. So get your board involved. They can also be your voice, mouthpiece and eyes and ears in the community, but maybe a way to attract some board members who perhaps don't have a high current net worth, but could leave something in their estate. And then finally, I talked a little bit about endowing current supporters. I won't go into that example again, but perpetuating those large annual givers, for the years after they won't be here anymore, and they can continue to support your organization. Brings us almost to the conclusion, and you'll see this on this slide and the next slide. Anytime you bring up the concept of plan giving, and this will be on your website, articles, direct mail, always include this precautionary clause that with any plan gift, be sure to consult first with your legal, financial, tax advisors. The last thing you want to do is come in with these great ideas, but then have a donor or you with a donor take off on your own and perhaps change that beneficiary on that life insurance, to your organization, only to find out that's part of a larger plan, and maybe that life insurance was dedicated to a grandchild's education or some other purpose. You want to get somebody in there, the financial legal team that's working with that donor. I use this in the church example, but it applies in the financial planning and estate planning example here. A three-legged stool. You as the nonprofit organization are one leg of the stool, the financial and legal advisor team's the other leg, and the donor's the third leg. Having everybody on the same page, keeps that stool in balance. But one or two of you go off and do your own thing, then that stool, becomes imbalanced and falls over and creates some problems, for an estate plan. So always include some language to this effect. Be sure and tell the donors to consult with their financial and legal and their tax advisors, just so that nobody gets in trouble or derails anything that's already in place. And so what I'll do is I'll close with a quote. One of my former colleagues and an A&M great in the terms of development, Dr. Bob Walker, he wrote a book several years ago talking about some of his experiences and stories in developing gifts for A&M, going back to the 60s. And he quoted a former student named Preston Utterback, who was class of 39. And Mr. Utterback gave him this quote for his book, for Dr. Walker's book. And it says, "Ladies and gentlemen, those of us who in plan giving what we want to do is help you make a gift so that you don't have to give up your fork until you're finished eating." And I think the analogy is very clear. Some donors are going to require use of their assets, and they don't want to give up those assets until the end of their lifetime. So they don't want to give up their fork until they're finished eating. And so I thought that quote was a good way to kind of put a bow tie on the end of the presentation here, and certainly open up for questions that may have come in the chat or otherwise. And I've also put my contact information on here. Email, phone. I'm also active on LinkedIn if you choose to reach out that way. And I would encourage follow-up conversations where I might be able to help out, either those viewing live right now or those that view this on the rebroadcast a little bit later on. And so at this point, Dr. Taylor, is there anything in the chat questions, or we can open up for questions at this time? Anything I can circle back on or examples maybe I can cover?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. We appreciate it. That's a great presentation and very good information for all of us to have. Phil did send in one question. I'll set it up, but I would ask Phil to chime in. Looks like he posted a question regarding unrestricted income at his particular organization. And is there a way to use funds to transition that into a trust? But Phil, you want to jump in with the particulars, please?
Sure. Thank you, Ken. Mark, this is Phil Reeves. I don't know if you can hear me, but wanted to just, okay, real quick question regarding our 501c 3C nonprofit. It's Cops for Kids for Burleson County. Wanted to know if as we receive charitable funds, we're required by state law under our certification to zero out our bank account at the end of the year. Is there a way we could set up a trust? And we're brand new, and so we're kind of learning as we go, but can we set up a charitable trust where we can funnel some of the proceeds that we don't have earmarked for distribution to use for, for later, for our 501c?
Yeah, Phil, good question. Without knowing the particulars of your organizational documents, let me answer very generally, and then you and I know each other outside of this call. We could continue offline if this doesn't answer your question, but
yeah,
our response would be subject to your governing documents and your bylaws. If you are you have to cancel out your current account. If your organizational structure allows you to have a restricted fund, in other words, if you internally restrict the funds to future needs, and those future needs, that restriction could be maybe creating your own endowment, putting the funds in a pool off which you draw. I mentioned this 4% distribution amount. If you could put money into such an endowment, and then the income come into y'all each year for your purposes. That to me would be and the endowment could be a restricted fund. It could be creating a separate legal entity type endowment, or it could be maybe putting the funds with a community foundation that would help fulfill that obligation. Different ways to do it, but if that's allowed within your documents, creating that endowment fund might be a good solution. But if that doesn't cover your question, maybe we can visit offline a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I need to review those documents, Mark, and I'll circle back with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, my initial thought went to an endowment as well for something like what Phil mentioned. I wonder if, not necessarily a show of hands, but any folks that have joined us today that actually have or have been hesitant about starting a planned giving campaign at their organization. Anyone out there been timid about this? I know some of the folks that join us are smaller organizations, have your hands full. Is this something that you've thought about at all? Anyone want to comment on that, please? And if not, Mark, one of the questions, I guess, in relation that I had for that is, and you provided some great tips, but maybe any examples that you've seen of how nonprofit organization development officers or executives, ease their way into implementing a planned giving campaign or program, or just any tips there, because this seems like a tough one for the organizations that I'm familiar with. Either it isn't something we're familiar with, or it sounds like a pretty tough task. Any other tips about how folks can kind of ease their way into thinking about a planned giving program?
Well, I touched on it a little bit earlier about maybe adopting a very limited scope, maybe only promoting bequests, since they're very well understood. it still takes the time, but it's a baby step. If you reach out and come up with some suggested bequest language, talk about those different ways of making a bequest that I mentioned in one of my slides, maybe taking a baby step and seeing, okay, what's the time commitment here? What's the response rate? And before I go off and just, the shotgun approach, hit everything to everybody, a baby step, I think would be a reasonable way to approach it. Again, not overwhelming. And you also don't want to get into a situation where maybe a development officer, they can't become an expert overnight, and bequests are very straightforward. And so the knowledge curve to be able to, I guess, talk about those, in my opinion, would not be as severe as getting into a charitable remainder trust, which is probably a higher level, topic as far as technical knowledge. So I would offer that. And then a passive program, again, put the information out there, but not necessarily go out and make specific calls to donors about this, but it's a baby step. It's out there. Let the donor come to you, whether it's your website, response card, let them come to you, but that way you're not taxing your personnel resources to an area that may or may not pay off, for the organization. I would throw those two ideas out there.
Great.
Kenny, this is Angela. I would also recommend, I've helped a couple organizations start their programs, and one of the easiest things to do is go ahead and get that bequest language. Mark, thank you for sharing and saying that you would. If you can have that tailored on your website. The other thing that's super easy is just put it on your pledge card. Right under if you'd like to make this gift anonymous, another checkbox, I'd like to, I'm interested in a planned gift. Now, keep in mind, some people think a planned gift is monthly credit card gifts. So sometimes you might learn that when you call and talk to them, but you wouldn't talk to them if they hadn't checked the box. So you're making a friend and you're getting a donor either way. It may just not be a legacy donor, but that's a really simple thing to do, costs nothing. You get a few hits per year. There are some other things that if you're interested in doing, it's a little bit more of a mid-level step, but there are vendors that for a relatively reasonable amount of money will give you a plan giving site and 2 newsletters a year that makes it look like you've got a plan giving staff. And I love working with mid-size and small organizations. And at some point that might be a good investment because like I said, it makes you look like you know a lot more. People can plug in their numbers. You've got a calculator. It's tailored to you, but it doesn't overburden your staff. So those are my 2 big tips that I use with folks.
Angela, excellent comments. Outsourcing, if your organization, your resources allow you to do some outsourcing, that's great. You bring in an outside expert, maybe on an as needed basis, or like you mentioned, some kind of a recurring newsletter or a pre-done website. I lost my train of thought. You mentioned outsourcing, and then you mentioned the first part of your response, Angela.
Just adding a checkbox on the traditional annual fund pledge cards.
Yes, it was about the bequest language. There's, I guess, 2 school of thoughts on that. The convenience factor of putting it on your website to where the donor or their attorney can simply pull off a PDF file. The other school of thought would be, contact, the development staff for that information, to kind of insert them in the process. That way, okay, I got a call from attorney, John Jones, and so he has a client out there that's thinking about us, and, gives you a point of reference as opposed to, maybe some mystery gift floating out there that you don't know about. At least you've initiated a point of contact. Now, the attorney may not reveal their client, but you could certainly ask the attorney to please have their client contact you, for a gift agreement or to talk about potential gift use, things like that. 2 schools of thoughts. It's just a matter of, which route you want to go. But great comments, Angela. Thank you.
So Mark, Will Horton says you need to catch up soon, and thanks for the information. And Charlotte asked if planned giving donations can or can't be used for operational expenses.
No reason they can't. That's, it's the golden rule, the donor has the gold, they get to make the rules, so to speak. They can certainly, I think by default, if there is no restriction or use, then the board could, make that decision. The donor could certainly specifically authorize use of the funds for operations. So no restriction I'm aware of. I mean, it's between the organization and the donor, with the default, silence being that, the organization's, board would have to make that decision. So no restriction I'm aware of.
Great.
Typically, because I'll add on, because usually larger amounts you're dealing with planned gifts, and I talked about being transformational earlier. I know my home church, growing up, when they received a large, I guess, a surprise, bequest, that jump-started them into thinking about, beyond just, current operations. They used that to start an endowment, and that was the seed money, because it was a large enough amount to kind of get them kicked off. If you like that old movie, was it Field of Dreams? Build it and they will come. You build the endowment, and then that would attract, more donors who see, okay, you've got an endowment, you've got a track record. We see how this endowment's being used. So it would attract other gifts. So a little bit of editorial there on the end.
Great. We've got just a couple minutes left, and I haven't seen any other questions. Maybe one quick thing for us. I'm just generalizing here with some of the organizations we work with, but many of our organizations, their donor pool is made up of more small to medium level donors. What would you say is a profile of donors that you've worked with, or can you generalize around those who are interested in, doing a planned gift to an organization? And are there any misconceptions out there in terms of how we think, or nonprofit organization leaders think about what that profile of potential planned giving donors might look like, or who they're made up of?
Well, I think a very different at would be age. Certainly, I can think of extreme examples on ends of the spectrum. Your recently graduated students, in the case of education, to your 90-year-old. But my experience would be age 50, 55 plus. If you're dealing with a typical, and again, I'm making a very broad brush here, but someone whose kids are, they're out of college, perhaps at that age, if they're having, kids that are, in their 20s, kids are out of school, they're adults, they're making a revamp in their estate plan. So they're redoing their wills from the, when the kids were, toddlers, to now they're adults, and just doing a revamp of their estate plan, I think would fall in that 50, 55 plus demographic. Certainly, I talked about younger donors earlier. So in addition to an age demographic, I would revert back to the passionate donor that really wants to do more. These are some ways that we talked about, some younger donors, how they could do a little bit more with life insurance. So passionate, age. We talked earlier about the endowing current support. Now, by small, I don't know if you $100 a year, $100 a month, what level we're at, but certainly can take that. One of the things we looked at A&M was number of years of consistent giving, was a very high indicator of a person's, passion and connection to the organization. So number of years of consistent giving, every year for 20 years, she sent us, $250 at Christmas, perfect candidate there. So there's three, I could think of more, but three off the top of my head. Invite others maybe that has some experience, would like to add some other, if we have time, add some other demographic ideas.
You hit on the last one. I was going to say, anybody that's given to you 10 years in a row definitely should be in your planned giving pool, and you should be talking with them. The other thing is with young donors. I've worked with an organization before where we actually talked to them about financial literacy. And we're talking about them as you go out and get your first job, you may have a 401k, and we could be a beneficiary of that. and some people will just leave it. So that was something that, it's a different way to talk to younger donors and helping them understand about the beneficiaries for life insurance, but also their retirement accounts.
Very good.
Excellent points.
Go ahead, Mark.
Taylor, I've got nothing else. And again, my information's there. Welcome any offline follow-ups. Glad to assist where I can.
Great. Thank you so much. Amazing presentation, great information for our audience. We thank you all for being here. We know we're over just by a minute or so, but wanted to give a quick highlight for next week's session, which again, myself and Nicole Collier are going to facilitate our presenters of Sarah Richards with the One Star Foundation and Ashley Harris over at United Ways of Texas. We're going to discuss COVID-19 and where do we go from here, and provide a local, state, and national response as to what's been going on and what nonprofits have experienced and how they have started to work beyond or settle into how COVID has affected our operations. So again, thank you so much for being here, Mark. Again, we appreciate you, and it was great to have you. And everyone who attended, good to see you as usual, and thanks for your continued support. We'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, thank you.